All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Bill Mosley, and I'm the current president of the AAG. And one of the greatest privileges of this job is that you get to hold up and honor some of the shining lights in our discipline. And Judith Carney has certainly been one of those people for me, and I assume many, many others in the room. So just to give you a sense of the logistics and how this is going to work, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Stanley Brunn Award. Then I have a commendation for Judy that I'm going to go through, and then I'm going to present her with the award. And we're going to smile and look pretty together. And then Judy's going to give her talk, which I'm really, really looking forward to. And then we're going to have Q&A afterwards. And so afterwards, if you have a question, there are mics in the aisles, and I invite you to come up, identify yourself, and then ask your question. So that's the plan. So it's my pleasure to present this year's Stanley Brunn Award for Creativity in Geography, made possible through the generosity of AAG member Stan Brunn. The award is presented annually to those who have made innovative contributions to the discipline of geography. These contributions may be based on field or laboratory research efforts and methodologies, qualitative or quantitative methods, geographical science and/or technology breakthroughs, work which intersects with the arts or humanities, or conceptual theoretical breakthroughs in geographic disciplinary thought that advance our thinking at local or global scales. The Brunn Award recognizes the most creative and cutting-edge work that geographers do, making significant contributions to new geographic methods and paradigms and introducing new and meaningful ways of thinking about human-environment relations at local or global scales. This year's Brunn Award recipient is Judith Carney, Distinguished Research Professor Emerita of Geography at UCLA and an early practitioner of political ecology whose fieldwork focused on human environment issues in West Africa and Latin America. Her publications over the past 4 decades examine the effects of agrarian transformations on gendered agricultural systems in Senegambia, the female-managed shellfishery of the Atlantic mangrove ecologies, the role of enslaved Africans in establishing African plant domesticates in New World slave societies, and the significance of subaltern agroecologies for food futures in the tropics. Professor Carney's research on African expertise and rice culture resulted in her book, Black Rice, The African Origins of Rice Cultivation in the Americas, published by Harvard University Press in 2001, which won the Melville Herskovits Award. Her second volume, In the Shadow of Slavery, Africa's Botanical Legacy in the Atlantic World, published in 2009 by University of California Press, illuminates the role of enslaved Africans in shaping New World food systems and was awarded the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. Professor Carney is an elected member of the British Academy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a fellow of the Association of American Geographers, from whom she also received its Distinguished Scholarship Honor, the Historical Geography Award, the Netting Award for Geography and Anthropology, and the Sauer Distinguished Scholarship Award. Her research has been supported by the National Geographic Society, John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, American Council of Learned Societies, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Wenner-Gren Foundation, and the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society. We commend Dr. Carney for her recognition as the Stanley Brunn Award winner for creativity in geography. Let's give Judy a round of applause. And I just want to add here that along with these accolades, for me, just as important is that Judy is a wonderful person. As a young scholar, I was so influenced by her scholarship. When she first started practicing this type of geography, we didn't call it feminist political ecology, but that was what it was. And it had a deep influence on my work. And it mattered that she actually responded to me, and we wrote some things together. And we can't say that for every shining light in our discipline. So she's also been just a wonderful mentor. So Judy, please come up. We have an award for you. So first of all is the plaque with your name on it. And then secondly, and I don't know if your mantle has more room for awards,
Whoa.
but this trophy. Yeah. So now for the real treat.
You think Donald Trump will come in?
Well, you could go visit Trump and he'd give him the award. I'm sure he would gladly receive it.
Doesn't have enough gold. Yeah, like. Well, thank you so much, Bill, for your wonderful words, and everybody here for coming. It's just great to see so many people I've adored and been so close to over the years, and some new faces as well. So thank you very much, and thank you for your kind words and for this award. It means a lot to me. So this picture is actually taken by a French photographer, and from Guinea-Bissau, and I just love it. So I thought, I'm putting this up. It's so beautiful. Anyway, so my discussion today builds on sort of the work I've been doing on African plants, food plants, and the African diaspora, and then situating it in terms of a lot of our contemporary concerns around food futures, especially growing all the more, we're growing more concerned about, especially as we see the heat here in San Francisco. I must say that it's one of the warmest days I've ever experienced in San Francisco. And what does this all mean in the future? And much of my discussion will focus on the tropics, so planting resistance, botanical legacies of the African diaspora, and Bill's wonderful book, Decolonizing African Agriculture, is in the back of my mind as I situate this. So, I'm a little nervous. A defining feature of food production in the 21st century is the rapid expansion of large-scale plantation agriculture. Across the New and Old World tropics, anthropologist Tanya Lee's outcry that plantations are back speaks to the resurgence of large-scale monocultures in tropical lands, reminding us of the plantation's advent in the New World some 5 centuries ago. Indeed, plantations have so influenced land use futures that the term plantationocene, as an alternative to the term Anthropocene, is used to underscore the biodiversity loss and racial tensions that continue in our time, with the renewed emphasis on monocultures. Oil palm plantations are expanding across Colombia, Brazil, Indonesia, Cameroon, and elsewhere. Soybeans now cover some 60 million hectares in South America, but plantation agriculture is devastating tropical biomes where the world's richest biodiversity is concentrated. It is accelerating extinctions of plant and animal species and of concern for our collective food futures. Monocultures are sweeping aside alternative farming systems that practice agrobiodiversity. These include not only food systems developed by native peoples, but also those with origins in Africa. My focus today is the New World tropics, where many of these imperiled land use systems have a compelling history. In particular, I'd like to discuss a distinctive subaltern food system that the enslaved themselves forged in the shadow of colonial plantation societies, which were devoted to growing highly profitable export crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, indigo, and rice. For the enslaved workforce who grew and harvested these commodity crops, food insecurity was a brutal fact of daily existence. Overworked and underfed, the enslaved took to growing their own food in the small yards around their dwellings. In this image of a Caribbean sugar plantation, the slave village can be seen on the right, the dwellings surrounded by fruit trees and diverse vegetation in an erstwhile monoculture of sugar cane. Other paintings and documents from the plantation period, as we shall see, affirm the presence of a different food order, one based on subsistence, hiding in plain sight within the plantation monoculture. After the abolition of slavery, this subaltern agricultural strategy evolved into the Afro-descendant smallholder farming system widely practiced to the present day. A defining feature of this alternative food system is the number of plants that are of African provenance. And I'm sorry for this eye chart, but this is quite a few number of plants. Notable introductions include sorghum, millet, yams, okra, the oil palm, cola of Coca-Cola fame, and black-eyed peas. Each and every one of these food plants was domesticated in Africa thousands of years ago. Some plants on this list, notably taro, pigeon peas, and plantains, are actually of Asian origin, but they were adopted into African food systems in prehistory through ancient Indian Ocean trade networks. And of course, we see rice, African rice, which appears on the list of plant introductions. We think of rice as a distinctly Asian crop, but we now know that West Africans independently domesticated a separate species of rice more than 3,000 years ago. And this African species, with the scientific name Rhizogloberema, was a major food staple of the region between Senegal and Gambia. These African crop introductions to plantation societies raise an obvious question. How did these food staples arrive in the New World and become key components of the subaltern food system developed by the enslaved? And to answer this and related questions, I'll go through these 5 points. The first, the enslaved were forced to plant export crops such as cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice, which much of the literature is about, but they also grew food for survival. And in this talk, my emphasis is on subsistence cultivation rather than the plantation export commodity. And this emphasis points to the importance of food grown in Africa for provisioning slave ships to New World plantation societies. Third, I'll discuss the agency of enslaved Africans in instigating the cultivation of familiar African foods on their humble food plots and creolizing them with Amerindian staples for their daily sustenance. Next, this food system also supported fugitive slave communities and later black farming strategies that developed after abolition. And I'll conclude by arguing that these systems today deserve policy support as biocultural refugia, a concept I'll return to in the conclusion. So let's now just step back some 5 centuries to the initial period of European maritime expansion and the beginnings of New World plantation economies. For decades following 1492, these were momentous on several levels, not only because Europeans arrived in the Americas and began wars of conquest and colonization, but also because European maritime expansion between the 16th and 19th century led to the unprecedented exchange of plants, animals, and microbes between several continents. And this movement of species, both intentional and unintentional, seen and unseen, historian Alfred Crosby famously called the Columbian Exchange. But Crosby was not merely interested in novel Amerindian species that naturalists brought back to Europe, such as tomatoes, potatoes, and maize. He also drew attention, importantly, to the food, plants, and animals that European migrants introduced from their homelands. And importantly, he recognized that the agents of botanical and biological transfers were not only men of science, but could be ordinary people as well. However, over the same time period of the Columbian Exchange, yet another significant intercontinental transfer of species was taking place. And in this instance, the plant transfers involved tropical crops, crops from Africa, while the agents of plant establishment were African and enslaved. And these African plant introductions were unlike any other discussed in the Columbian Exchange literature because they arrived as a direct consequence of the transatlantic slave trade, which between the 16th and 19th centuries involved at least 36,000 recorded slave voyages and the forced migration of some 12.5 million Africans to the Americas. So one of the striking features of the plantation era is the number of European accounts that credit the enslaved with the introduction of specific foods, all previously grown in Africa. And we can identify several plants that naturalists and visitors to plantation societies claimed slaves introduced. Among these are yams, sorghum, millet, rice, sesame, black-eyed and pigeon peas, taro, the kola nut, and okra. So if we take at their word commentaries penned by these prominent historical figures such as Willem Piso and Georg Markgraf, naturalists on the first scientific expedition to Brazil in the 1640s, Thomas Jefferson, and others who made these claims, we might ask, how is it possible that the enslaved introduced crops to the Americas? After all, Africans were brought to plantation societies in bondage and without personal possessions. Crediting enslaved Africans with plant introductions attributes to them an agency that is entirely at odds with long-standing assumptions. So why would these prominent historical witnesses claim these plants as introductions by slaves? During the transatlantic slave trade, Africa, in fact, often produced surplus food. In the rainy season, captives awaiting shipment to New World slave ports could be put to work growing crops that would subsequently be sold as provisions for the Atlantic crossing. These were typically African cultivars, since European food staples such as wheat, rye, and oats grew poorly in the tropics. And here we see such food fields shown in this image from a slave fort along the Ghana coast from 1727. And this is one of many. I mean, you can see I've been amplifying the archive here with my images that I look for around what I find fragmentary comments about. So, from an early period, Europeans took notice of the distinctive way in which food was prepared in Africa. And this detail of a Portuguese navigational map from 1633 features a glyph of the Portuguese Elmina slave-holding fortress. And to the right, we see two figures engaged in the traditional African method of hand-milling grain with mortar and pestle, a task long associated with female labor in Africa. Slave ships carried some food supplies from Europe, but captains also relied on African surpluses to feed the enslaved captives across the Middle Passage. The slave ship voyage could last 6 months, or 6 weeks, or months. So sufficient food stores were vital. Captains of slavers routinely purchased African grains such as rice, sorghum, and millet, as well as Amerindian maize and peanuts, which the Portuguese had introduced to Africa in the early 16th century. African crops featured prominently in slave ship provisions because Europeans commonly believed mortality rates were reduced when captives were fed foods to which they were accustomed. Often, the purchased grain was unmilled, that is to say, with the grains in edible hulls still attached. The distinction I am making between milled and unmilled grain is actually quite important because, and significantly, any unmilled grain is also a seed, which also means any unmilled grain remaining from a slave voyage could potentially serve as seed for growing it elsewhere. Thus, as Africans arrived in the Americas, so did African food staples, and these soon appeared in the food gardens that the enslaved planted for their own subsistence. How did this happen? The written record is, for the most part, silent. However, an oral history of one crop introduction told by the maroon descendants of runaway slaves offers an intriguing explanation. Maroons who live in remote communities across northeastern South America grow rice, a crop introduced to the Americas. They have long maintained rice is a crop that their enslaved forebears introduced. Across the Guianas through Amazonic Brazil, Maroons recount a shared oral history about their ancestors. And I'd like to note that it's always an enslaved female ancestor who smuggled grains of rice off the slave ship. And this, their descendants say, is how we came to grow rice. But to serve as seed, the smuggled grains could only have been rice with its hulls still attached, that is, rice that is not yet milled. During slave voyages, any grain that was put on the ship in unmilled form required the indigestible hulls to be removed for consumption. To this end, captains of slave ships relied on the traditional African mortar and pestle and the expert labor of enslaved females to perform this task, as we saw in the previous slide. Close examination of an 18th century painting of the Danish slave ship, the Fredensborg, provides compelling context for the maroon oral history of rice beginnings, and please look carefully at a small detail near the stern of the ship along its quarterdeck behind the barricade where enslaved women were kept, for it illustrates something often missing, and we rely only on historical or archival accounts of slave ship voyages. The highlighted view clearly shows two enslaved figures with hand-held pestles milling grain in the traditional African way in a wooden mortar. They are certainly enslaved females, not just because milling is traditionally a woman's task, but we see it taking place in the rear of the ship where female captives were held and, at times, put to work preparing food. We don't know if the women are hand milling sorghum, millet, or rice, but we do know that none of these African crops were present in the Americas prior to the arrival of European slavers and enslaved Africans. Certainly most slave ships did not arrive in plantation societies with leftover food stores, but those that occasionally did presented female captives an opportunity to access seeds and rootstock of familiar foods and the possibility to establish them anew. This painting then lends striking support to the maroon oral history, revealing that women were indeed in a position to take unmilled grain, seed rice, off of slave ships. How did they do so? This is a wonderful YouTube video that Tindy van Andel, a Dutch ethnobotanist, put together with a maroon woman from Suriname. Actually, it's filmed in French Guiana. So the maroon oral history recounts how women hid grains of rice in their hair before disembarking the slave ship. And here we see Edith Ajako, a maroon descendant, showing Tindy van Andel how this was done. And Edith demonstrates the technique with her daughter Onika by braiding grains in her hair, one by one, until they can no longer be seen. Her enactment speaks poignantly to smuggled seeds and smuggled knowledge. Central to this maroon oral history is the significance of slave ships and enslaved women for seed transfers from Africa. It substitutes the agents of global seed transfers of Columbian exchange accounts, that is to say, European navigators, colonists, naturalists, and men of science, with the agency of enslaved African women whose deliberate efforts to smuggle seeds of preferred foods reestablished African foodways such as rice-based dishes in New World plantation societies. And Professor Van Andel's research has brought additional scientific credibility to the maroon oral history of rice introductions to plantation societies. In 2010, she found African rice, Oryza glaberrima, still being cultivated in Suriname's maroon communities, where elsewhere in the country it had long been replaced by Asian rice, Oryza sativa. Van Andel's fieldwork and subsequent genetic and ethnobotanical studies her group performed traced this rice introduction back to West Africa and during the period of the transatlantic slave trade. So now let's just turn to the sites on the plantations where the enslaved established African dietary staples. Slaves planted subsistence foods in the yards surrounding their dwellings and on marginal plantation land unsuited to commodity production. And in this image, please note the slave quarters in the forested area directly behind the sugar mill. But what appears as forest is actually a food forest. The trees are likely fruit trees, which formed an integral component of the food system that the enslaved developed for subsistence. This painting provides an eye-level view of a slave dooryard or kitchen garden, and the area around the dwelling was planted to a diverse array of food crops, some Amerindian and some African. I've identified a few here. By creolizing the plant heritages of tropical Africa and the New World tropics, the enslaved created a distinctive food system on their food plots in plantation societies. In contrast to the dominant plantation monoculture, theirs emphasized an agro-biodiverse polyculture. And by polyculture, I am referring to a systematic interplanting of seeds, tubers, legumes, vegetables, and fruit trees. This agricultural strategy mimics the tangled vegetative architecture of a tropical forest, in that a medley of diverse plants growing together offers protection from insect predation, heavy downpours, and soil erosion. This planting strategy is a proven way of producing food in tropical climates where there is not a real cold season to purge the environment of predators and pathogens. And in this slide, we see two other sites where enslaved people grew their food. On the far right is a sketch of the plantation's provision grounds. Provision grounds were set aside and organized for food cultivation by the plantation owner. And on the far left, circled in red, is a small but very important site. In some plantation areas, slaves were able to plant food on steep terrain that was otherwise unsuited to sugar production. Such marginal areas were often made available to slaves for growing their own food. In contrast to plantation provision grounds, these sites of subsistence cultivation were directly managed by the enslaved themselves. And in the center of the slide, I've included a stanza from an 18th century poem by a plantation owner on St. Kitts. The poem advises in verse that slaves be given mountain grounds or waste broken land to carry out their own food production and be allowed a day each week to tend the plots. On plantations where this privilege was granted, the plots were known as slaves' independent production. Some 18th century European observers took note of the subaltern food system developed by the enslaved. C.G.A. Oldendorp, a Moravian missionary to the Danish West Indies in the 1760s, mentioned the diverse food crops that the enslaved cultivated together in their subsistence plots. And of those he listed, we recognize many of African origin. And you can see I've put the ones that I could identify. In pre-revolutionary Haiti, this African inflection in slave food plots caught the attention of a French official. He called them Petite Guinées, referencing Guinea, the name widely used for Africa at the time. Such humble food plots located in the interstices of plantation economies became, in effect, the botanical gardens of the Atlantic world's dispossessed. And it was on such modest food plots that slaveholders and naturalists encountered for the first time many unfamiliar tropical crops of African origin. With no name for these novel food and medicinal plants, colonial languages borrowed the African words for them. And this table lists a few linguistic borrowings in English and Portuguese. English words derived from African languages include yam, okra, kola, and beni for sesame. Throughout plantation societies, the enslaved consistently pressed for the right to grow food on plots they could independently manage. When conferred, independent production meant the slaveholder no longer needed to provide or pay for daily food rations. But while this arrangement put the enslaved entirely in charge of their own subsistence, it established for them an important convention. Time each week exempted from plantation work to tend their food plots. Significantly, this modest grant of labor autonomy secured for the enslaved the right to benefit from any surpluses that could be bartered or sold, including small food animals in weekly markets. Decades ago, Sidney Mintz and Douglas Hall made the important point that slaves' independent production supplied regional food networks in plantation societies with their fresh produce and meat, which otherwise were imported or in limited supply. But I'd like to add yet another observation, that these slave food plots can also be seen as sites of liberatory practices and resistance, which would prove indispensable in the long struggle for autonomy and freedom. For these food plots provided the seeds and root cuttings that runaways took with them when they fled bondage. In many plantation societies where frontiers had not yet closed, fugitives were at times able to band together and form maroon communities in areas beyond colonial control. A few maroon communities managed to survive across many generations, despite the constant threat of discovery by militias sent to crush them and crush these outposts of resistance and to re-enslave the inhabitants. And this sketch from 1727 is an eyewitness drawing of a Dutch militia's destruction of a maroon hamlet in the interior of Suriname. Nonetheless, the colonial government failed to eradicate its Maroons, who today make up 1/4 of Suriname's population. There's a lot of interesting things going on in this image, and you may note as the Maroon settlement is burning, you can also see people fleeing and Mastiff dogs being set to capture them. Other drawings of vanquished fugitive settlements illustrate where Maroon communities were sited and the foods they grew. And these 18th century images show the importance of a permanent source of water. Along the circles here are all vanquished Maroon communities in Minas Gerais, Brazil, after a succession of militias sent against them. But also we can determine that not only the need for tributaries of water, fresh water, year-round supply, but also choices of what foods would be grown preferentially. And these we see on the slide on the right are rice, yams, and plantains. But importantly, what they tell us is for runaway slaves, self-liberation and survival depended vitally on being able to produce adequate food reserves. In Amazonic Brazil, thousands of slaves fled rice and cotton plantations for refuge within the uncharted Amazon rainforest. These maroon settlements are known in Portuguese as quilombos, and government militias sent in pursuit at times recorded the crops the quilombolas grew. And in bold, from some of their reports, I put in bold the foods that are of African origin, that appeared of African origin. These crops constituted the escape agriculture that enabled the self-liberated runaways to survive. They demonstrate the diffusion of the slave subaltern food system from the plantation plot to fugitive slave communities. Maroon food fields can thus be understood as an extension or a scaling up of the slave food plot. Brazil abolished slavery. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, the last country in the Americas to do so. After emancipation, the mixed crop agroecological practices of both the enslaved and Maroons endured. These farming strategies became the foundation by which freed persons post-abolition sought to escape new forms of labor exploitation and reimposed social hierarchies. From the 1960s to the 1980s, geographers and anthropologists began systematic study of Afro-descendant peasant farms in the New World tropics, and they drew attention to the farming system's emphasis on agrobiodiversity and sustainability, even though neither term had yet come into common use. And here are two representative Afro-descendant farms from the period. This Afro-descendant food system is still practiced in some locales of the New World tropics, and what may appear as a vegetative chaos is actually a carefully cultivated, highly efficient polyculture. The variety of crops strategically spaced horizontally as well as vertically protect and enrich fragile soils by creating and concentrating nutrients in the biomass. Such agrobiodiversity is typically achieved without chemical inputs such as pesticides or inorganic fertilizers. Today, climate change is bringing renewed interest to heritage Afro-descendant farming systems in tropical America, particularly those practiced by Maroons. A recent study of one Quilombo polyculture in Brazil registered 84 species and land races planted together on a few hectares of community farmland. Excuse me. These Afro-descendant farms harbor deep reserves of agroecological knowledge, shaped and maintained during centuries of hardship and experimentation. They have been tested under oppressive regimes of slavery and post-slavery histories of Black dispossession. This legacy speaks powerfully to the resilience of these agroecological systems, even though Afro-descendant farmers across the Americas continue the struggle to hold onto land they farmed for generations. Entire Maroon communities continue to face land grabs for dam projects, industrial mining and resource extraction, timbering, and large-scale agro-industrial monocultures. These tensions play out prominently in the ongoing Quilombo struggle to obtain legal title to their legacy farmland. Although explicitly promised in Brazil's 1988 Constitution, legal recognition of this community land has proceeded at a glacial pace. Since then, of the 3,500 Quilombo communities who have registered, the federal government of Brazil has granted titles to only 494, a mere 7% of the total petitioned. The resurgence of monocultures across tropical America, this time based on soy and oil palm, makes formal recognition of Maroon community land rights more urgent than ever. One possible way to credential their land claims is to apply the concept of biocultural refugia to these collective Afro-descendant holdings. This concept was originally developed to protect heritage landscapes of temperate Europe as a hedge against the consequences of climate change, especially increased food shortages, rising prices, and market fluctuations that can destabilize the existing food order. Biocultural refugia referred to places that not only shelter species, but also carry knowledge and experiences about practical management of biodiversity and ecosystem services of those who have historically lived and farmed there. Such agroecological land use strategies are often supported by oral histories and cultural practices. They are often dismissed as traditional or peasant farming, even when generations of proven stewardship demonstrate socio-ecological resilience. The biocultural refugia concept describes many Afro-descendant farm communities in tropical America who similarly marshal specific agroecological knowledge and cultural experiences that have been curated over centuries of vital and ongoing engagement with their surroundings. In short, they represent living archives of Black ecological knowledge in the Americas. Afro-descendant biocultural refugia differ uniquely from their European counterparts in that the collective funds of knowledge and experience are tied to social memories of slavery, food insecurity, and struggles for freedom and autonomy. In Europe, the term has been applied to landscapes where tenure rights are secure and unquestioned. But in contrast, heritage Afro-descendant agroecologies have largely persisted without such guarantees. Today, these neotropical enclaves exist in highly contested areas, experiencing direct challenges to their survival. In this respect, expanding the biocultural refugia concept to Afro-descendant heritage farmscapes safeguards a remarkable legacy food system, acknowledges the inhabitants' ancestral land rights, and furthers the climate policy objective of more resilient food futures. Dependence upon fossil fuels, GMOs, agrochemicals, and machinery sets apart our contemporary era of plantation monocultures from its earlier slave-based incarnation. Nevertheless, oppressive racialized hierarchies continue to bookend what some refer to as the Plantationocene era, even if they today appear in a different guise. This is because the historical and socio-ecological residues of plantation capitalism remain ever present in contemporary patterns of land use, species extinctions, resource conflict, and Black dispossession. In contrast, Afro-descendant heritage farms defy this history of racial capitalism, while pointing the way towards more sustainable food systems. These New World food farms have been tested over centuries in multiple environments and under some of the most trying socio-ecological circumstances humanity has ever faced. And this brings me to an important point about migration and food. A critical feature of human migration the world over is the continuity of traditional food preferences across space and the dislocations of geography. That the migration of Africans was compelled through extremes of violence and privation did not diminish this universal desire or preclude the possibility of achieving it. African crops enabled the enslaved to reinstate some food traditions of specific cultural heritages and to combine ingredients in new ways with Amerindian and European foods. In this way, the enslaved discreetly broke the monotony and chronic shortfalls of the food regimens slaveholders typically imposed. Africans and their descendants profoundly shaped the foodways of plantation societies through the dishes that enslaved female cooks prepared for slaveholders. African foods steadily made their way onto planters' tables. In this way, the African crop introductions encourage the distinctive and today much celebrated regional cuisines that developed across plantation societies. Consider, for example, rice-based dishes such as hop and john, made with African black-eyed pea, okra-based gumbos, jambalaya, and pepper pot stews, fritters made with black-eyed peas or plantains, collards, and other greens. These are the celebrated foodways of Charleston, New Orleans, Salvador, Brazil, and many other regions of the African diaspora. So to conclude, the biocultural history of plants and their entangled links with human societies asks us to be attentive to the places and spaces where the disenfranchised have or are able to challenge dominant food orders. Moreover, it reminds us of the significance of food for ongoing realizations of autonomy and freedom, not only in the African diasporic history I've discussed today, but also in current efforts by food-insecure people living in urban food deserts of the Americas to repurpose public spaces for growing healthy food. And this final image is from Los Angeles, where I live, and it illustrates how Afro-descendant food heritages continue to take root in unexpected places. And here we encounter LA's guerrilla gardener Ron Finley, who plants broken city sidewalks and abandoned urban lots with a tangled medley of crops, polycultures, for the food insecure to freely harvest. So when we pay attention then to where such plants are emplaced in rural and urban landscapes, it allows us to think through and against the Plantationocene. It also allows us to imagine and enact food futures that can be simultaneously climate resilient, agroecological, participatory, equitable, and responsive to persistent racial injustice. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy, for an amazing talk, for giving us new ways to think about food futures. As I said, we have some time for questions. So please, if you have a question, come up to one of the mics, introduce yourself. Oh, Lisa's going to run the mic around, so you can just raise your hand. Looks like we have a hand in the back.
There's a hand here? Oh, okay.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. My name is Alyssa Nelson. Long before I officially became a geographer, I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali, West Africa. So there's a lot here that's familiar, and I learned a lot from it. Thinking about my own path to geography, I'm very curious about yours. How did you get into this particular area of expertise? And when you look back, are there pieces that connect that you might not have seen from the beginning?
This is your life. Wow. I don't know. I actually grew up in a sort of food insecure situation in Detroit, losing a parent very young with an immigrant mother without much education, a lot of kids. But I've always thought about food and its availability. But I don't know, it's just reading Carl Sauer's Agricultural Hearths and Dispersals. What was it? Agricultural Origins, it's changed. So Seeds, Hearths, and Spades, right? Seeds, Spades, and Hearths, something. The title changed over the years. And I saw that he was at Berkeley, but he had already retired. I didn't think about people's mortality at that time. I just thought, oh, I'll go meet him. And I didn't look at when the book was written. And I ended up, thanks because Michael Watts joined the faculty at Berkeley when I was a graduate student. I'll never forget his lecture that landed him the job, very enthusiastic, and ended up working with Michael. I started out as a Latin Americanist and ended up in Africa and a lot of food insecure households and poverty. And just started thinking about this whole idea of food availability. And I don't know, it's really hard to trace it all for me, frankly. It's just was seeing people who are really hungry, and sometimes choices made at the household level of whether they would, who would get more food than others, which was kind of a sense of stratifying in deep poverty, who would live and who not. And maybe you saw some of that as well in Mali. I think most of us who've worked in rural Africa have had that experience. But is there anything else you want to prompt me with? I'm really nervous today for some reason. Keep me going.
Well, I want to appreciate that you said in front of everybody that you're nervous. I think it's really important, especially to young scholars, to have experienced Professor Emerita admitting that she's also nervous.
It doesn't go away.
Thank you. That was a wonderful explanation. And I'm always curious about where people come from, and I'm always thinking about my younger colleagues getting to see somebody and their life path and how that intertwines both professionally and personally. So thanks.
Yeah. Mary Beth, we should ask Mary Beth next because she's known me forever. Don't ask me anything too hard, Mary Beth. I'm nervous.
This is kind of following up a bit. And so I'm wondering if your work in Latin America, because the question is like, well, you're in Africa, like how did you jump over to South Carolina? And how did you come back over the ocean? So I'm wondering if there's a way in which starting in Latin America and then moving to Africa is, sort of then like, it's not coming full circle, but you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
Like, there were like kind of, just like the rice and there were like seeds planted in your head, maybe that you didn't know about.
Right. Well, it's true. I was a Latin Americanist in graduate school, and then Michael Watts came to the department, and I then switched after my PhD exams to work in Africa, of which I had no training or nothing but his inspiration, and ended up being an Africanist. And I remember working in the archives, which you, Michael, encouraged me to do because you'd done so much work with silent violence. And I did, and I remember reading some document from the early 19th century, or it was in the early 19th century, about rice here could rival the Carolina. And it was like, Carolina, really? And I think we had a conversation about that and said, yeah, we're talking about South Carolina, Carolina colony. And then it was like, wow, when I'm done with my dissertation, I have to look at that. And then that kind of led to South Carolina and learning that they had a rice plantation economy that I didn't really know anything about because I've done most of my work in Brazil, parts of Latin America, and West Africa. So it kind of moved in that organic direction, and thank you for reminding me. Mary Beth was my roommate at the time. I need audience prompts. Yeah.
So I have my name's Aaron DeGrassi. I have a comment and a question. The comment is big thanks for the Portuguese version of the book, which you also shared with me, and I was happy to share also with friends and colleagues in Angola. And the question, kind of following up on these last points, was about movement of people within the Americas, because also in the historical literature on sort of different groups of enslaved people, there's been more attention to movement between even Argentina and different parts of Brazil and the Caribbean, if that was also kind of a part of the story in terms of movement, not just from the continent here, but within the Americas also.
Yeah. Yeah, so what did you want me to?
No,
And you just did a great job. I'm happy to deflect back to the audience. Yeah.
Just if that movement of food being brought from different parts in the Americas by the movement of different enslaved people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this was a thing that was, I mean, I just scratched the surface on looking at, I mean, I was like, another neurotic evening in my life, thinking about like, okay, all this food's coming from Africa. I mean, from the way I first read it, so much food for the slave ships. I was like, how did they feed all these people, right? Okay, they're not being fed well, yes, but they still have to be fed or they're not going to make it across the Atlantic. And it was horse beans, fava beans, right? Fava beans and things brought from Europe. And it's like, wow, that's like more than a month away to get to West Africa, and then could be many months, sometimes half a year, to fill a slave vessel, right? And so I started going through just what was available, like in abstruse ship captain ledgers and documents about what were they buying. And they were buying rice all the time, but because rice was always seen as an Asian crop, that wasn't problematized very deeply. And then they were buying sorghum and millet, and I knew those were, at least some millets are African, and then beans, but even though they don't clarify what the beans were. And so, and people had said it's just fava beans, right? And it turns out that there was a lot of food being loaded on these slave ships from these different ports. And in fact, if there was a weather-related famine or a human labor-related famine because of the slave trade, there could be real problems for the ship captain who wanted to forcibly bring people across the Atlantic. They couldn't succeed. And so the food question started popping out at me that mostly, and then I started reading accounts of diaries that the several slaveholders had kept of their voyage, saying there wasn't enough food to load on these ships. So it just turned the whole thing from like just a discussion around commodities to the food that facilitated this movement of enslaved people into the Atlantic world, and how were they fed. And so that was quite interesting. And then I did some research in the archives in France, and basically there found work about the botanists being really quite taken by all of the rice that they're finding in the early period of colonialism in Africa, in the Sudan area, not Sudan the country, but the Sahelian area. And it was like, that rice looked very different to many of them, and they commented on this. And then all of a sudden, the pieces start falling together, that this is really a story that seems on one level very prosaic around food, but it is a powerful story because the commodity needs to be fed, that they're making a commodity of this in the transatlantic slave trade. And therein lies so much of a story of humanity, of claims of survival, that it is, to me, it was just like never ending. I was like, oh my goodness, and I just thought it was going to be a slight excursion, and basically 10 or 15 years and 2 books, because it wasn't just about rice, it was about a number of other crops. But because so many of these crops also, by agronomists, were saying, well, they may be Asian or they may be African, because a lot of African crops were designated as of Asian origin until fairly recently, especially with genetics clarifying a lot of that. So it, in a sense, becomes like a detective story that you find yourself involved in, and then you find the prosaic nature of what is being done and the horrors behind it. And food is just so central for seeing that. And also the way in which it's a tropical to tropical story. That helped when I kind of focused it a little bit more on Brazil, where many of the crops that could be grown in temperate areas weren't so readily grown in some of the slave-based societies. So it was quite a passion to think about this in a very different way and about what food means, in terms of commerce, any type of commerce. Yeah. Michael?
There's another question in the back.
Was there? I didn't see it. Yeah. Hi, I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Is the microphone working? Okay. Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. Yeah, it's working.
Was there experimentation, for example, on the dooryard polycultural plots or in the rural communities, integrating animals with these African-based crops, or was there a livestock middle passage story? Where as you see it?
I actually, that's such a good question, because I really think there's another story going on. There have been some genetic studies that show the trypanosome-resistant African Ndama cattle. It's I think they have humped and humpless. I think it's a humpless cattle. It's a short, stocky one that you would see in northern Nigeria and I would see in Gambia. And that this cattle breed likely was brought across. I've come across a few references to animals being transported across the Middle Passage. Guinea fowl, Oviedo's talking about guinea fowl right off. I mean, they're there almost immediately because they're small stock and they can be managed. And of course, these kinds of animals are also going into, with maroonage, they're going into or maronage, as some say, going into flight from slavery with the enslaved. And we definitely, there are some genetic analyses that have been done recently with cattle to show that this African cattle breed does appear in some wild livestock that have been found, especially in the more tropical parts of Brazil. There's a few studies on that. And there are some studies about animals being put on the slave ship because, you didn't have refrigeration, right? All you had was you're salting or you're holding the animals live on board. But you also have people, and that makes it really complicated on slave ships. So small stock, definitely. And so there is a story still to be fully told, I think. I have a little bit about it in my work, but it was, it would take a lot of sleuthing, and also the genetics material that is now available, genetic analyses, would help, I think, in that. Yeah, but it's such a good question, yeah.
Our patient person back here.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Carney, for the great presentation, and I've admired your work for a while now because I'm basing my PhD research in the Gambia. What I'm dealing with is colonial heritage, and I'm dealing with how colonial heritage infrastructures are attached to development schemes and are in turn erasing the place and the people connections around the Kunta Kinte Island. I'm sure you visited. And I'm wondering, how do you see the work that you're doing with African diaspora and the food heritage pathways contributing to the process of decolonization of knowledge systems and how heritage narratives are perceived locally in West Africa? Would you be able to?
I think you have a wonderful book ahead of you because you're asking the right kinds of questions. Michael Watts has done a lot of work on looking at some of these structures too. I don't know where to go. I think, so can you just field out just some smaller questions of that for me so I can do that? I'm kind of nervous. I don't know why I'm so nervous
I can set up
today,
an example
everybody.
for you.
I apologize. I'm like, I just don't want to discourage you, but when you become a professor, you don't necessarily just go up there and bloviate all the time. You actually can get nervous still in front of an audience, and here I am.
If it helps, I'm more nervous than you. I can set up an example. For example, the rice farming practices that are, based on the gender divisions of labor in the Gambia. Mandinka women are responsible for developing the rice fields, and they're affected by climate change. But most of the climate change adaptation practices are focused on this idea of heritage that comes from this perspective of how Europe and the Oriental gaze would perceive just the colonial infrastructure in the place as heritage, like very physical infrastructure based. But there are these intangible heritage practices like the foodways and the practice of developing rice and the saltwater intrusion and etc. is sort of ignored and like really not paid attention because it's not fitting into the development ideas and the schemes of the place. So when I was there in the Gambia, women would tell me about this embankment that was 30 years old and it wasn't made, but they're just building new roads, new pathways, and so the food security is really affected locally. So if that example helps.
Yeah. Plus ça change, plus ça reste la même chose, right? It's like these development agendas still aren't speaking to what local people need, and they get a trajectory that comes out of, Italy or FAO or something and just continue to do this. So I don't know. Michael, I'm going to ask you, do you have anything that you would add to that because it's really kind of the same story as when we were going there and doing work. Yeah, and I mean, I would be more than happy to talk to you personally about a number of things that you've raised, but just, the development agendas that get run down in these places really aren't focusing on applications for local people that would really help them without having to be part of far-flung markets and financial structures that they are not going to be able to tap into. So trying to do a more low-key, intermediate, or bottom-up kind of development still has not significantly shifted in those communities, I don't think so. But you should come up afterwards and maybe we can arrange a time to talk in greater detail because I'm really interested in what you're doing.
So we have one final question, and then sadly we're going to be at time. So.
Hi, Judy. Ben Kantner from UCLA, PhD student in geography, as you know. One thing that caught my attention with your idea of biocultural refuge and thinking of with the framework of the plantationist, which is incredible for considering these types of questions and conflicts and issues, is regarding transgenic versions of some of these African crops that were brought to the Americas, to Brazil, and were incorporated in food systems that we now recognize as biocultural heritage. Right. Have you encountered examples of Afro-descendant peoples working to push back on the transgenic development of some of these traditional crops? I know there's examples of indigenous groups in Hawaii or in other locations around the world that have encountered corporations that are now seeking to patent certain versions of these crops and essentially take away this biocultural heritage.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Ben. And I'm sorry, I'm stepping away. I hope you can still hear me. I actually think this is a real issue because everybody wants to apply whatever they think should be going down with these people rather than starting from what do you need and what would you like. And I guess the first thing that comes to mind is this presumed cross between African rice, Oryza glaberrima, and the Asian rice, Oryza sativa, Nerica rice, new rice for Africa, which Paul Richards had already said there is a generally they don't cross readily, genetically. But Paul Richards had already described this many decades ago as happening in Sierra Leone, that these do, and people do notice it when it happens, and it leads to a very sturdy and adaptable, in-place rice that can be grown. And so somebody at one of the West African Rice Development Association gets all this credit and gets a food prize for coming up with NERICA, New Rice for Africa, which in a laboratory he crossed. But it wasn't, it hasn't been really quite a success, because climate, you know, they're trying to come up always with one thing that does everything, that fits everything, and the climate is going nuts. We see it here today. You know, I like it 80 degrees, but I do fear for what this might mean. And with the kind of climate change we're talking about, and I think, Bill, your last book just hits it, Decolonizing African Agriculture. This is just such a brilliant book. Is just to, like, we need to get out of the one-size-fits-all, plus like, you know, pest predation and everything. And we need to start thinking of more flexible systems that are based on what people themselves know and need. And the one-size-fit-all doesn't do very well when we're having all kinds of changes in climate. And so I think this is, I mean, I really did love his book and think he's speaking so much truth to what's going on in terms of where we as academicians, scholars, lots of field work, where we need to be thinking in the future. And we have been doing this for a long time, but the organizations that are pushing these aren't always listening so much to us. They will if there's a disaster, and then oh, what do you think we should do, right? But would you like to add something to that, Bill? Because I really loved your book.
I didn't pay you to say that. And,
He didn't.
We are at time, but let's give Judy a big round of applause. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I wasn't in my desk.